Constantine, my friends, from the east, and he overthrew the Western Empire at the Battle of Milvian, the bridge, and he took over the Roman Empire. I mean, in those days in the West, there was the festivals of these pagan ideas that we see in the West. And in the West, like I said, Constantine helped bring in a mixture of paganism and Christianity, because with that, he could gather the mass of people. There'd be more people in the church by doing that mixture thing. It was all about money. Take a look at the book of Revelation, the 7 church ages. It beautifully depicts what's happening with the church and how it grew and how it became pagan. Doctrines of Balaam. I mean, that's very clear. It was the mixture, the doctrine of Jezebel. What did Jezebel do? She mixed, she trapped the Israelites by bringing in a mixture. Well, my friends, while they were celebrating the so-called birth of Jesus in 400 AD, Chrysostom in the East was invited to come and join the celebration. Chrysostom was kind of like a pastor. He was a church father, and he was invited in celebrating the birth of Jesus, which, my friends, was just a mixture of paganism. Replace the pagan holiday. Remember Jove and all the gods? And that principle is very simple. Chrysostom said when he was invited to come and partake of this so-called birth of Jesus that he had never, ever even heard of the so-called birth of Jesus to December 25th, and he abhorred those practices and never clung to those practices. This is the pastor that came from Antioch. Another thing that's very clear is Tertullian. Tertullian was another church father, and he had this to say. He said, the heathens have never, ever lost their festivals. And he was making claims to this so-called Christmas holiday.
For the most part, the pagan midwinter festivals were a time of joy and celebration, a release from everyday duties and social restrictions. All that could be done to prepare for winter had been done. The granaries were full, the animals slaughtered, so the time was ripe for feasting. Since there was little work to be done until spring, these feasts often lasted for days and were full of joyous, lusty carousing, with much eating, drinking, love-making, and scaring away of evil spirits. Yes, evil spirits, for winter was the time when death and darkness ruled the earth and attracted ghosts and otherworld spirits to roam among the living. In the dead of winter, the evergreen symbolized the permanence of the life force. Its green, death-defying leaves suggested strange powers, as if they contained the sun within themselves, and of all the evergreens. Holly and ivy and mistletoe, which all bear fruit only in the winter, were seen as a triumph of fertility over the forces of darkness and death. For as long as is known, these plants were brought into the house to protect the home from the evil spirits so abundant during the dark time of the year, and to attract fruitfulness in the year to come. Evergreen trees, which didn't bear fruit, were decorated with gilded nuts and apples. Mistletoe was especially revered by the Celtic priest class, known as the Druids. They called it the all-healer, and not only did it increase the productivity of the soil and fertility of cattle, it also cured impotence, and sprigs fixed above doorways kept away lightning and many kinds of evil. Since mistletoe has no roots in the ground, it was believed to come from heaven itself, and that's what gave it wondrous powers. If the mistletoe grew on the sacred oak, it was especially powerful. To the Greeks and the Celtic Druids, the oak was the holy tree which, when struck by lightning, transported the gift of fire from the sun god to the earth. On the 6th day of the moon, clad in white robes, the archdruid would cut down the mistletoe with golden sickles and catch it in a white cloth, so it would be untouched by human hand. Afterward, 2 white bulls were sacrificed. Mistletoe was also sacred to the Greeks and Romans, who thought it was created when lightning struck a tree and represented sexual energy. The Germanic tribes believed that all who passed under the mistletoe were kissed by Freya, the goddess of fertility, and were blessed with sexual power. Today, kissing under the mistletoe is only an excuse to steal an innocent kiss. But it began as part of the fertility rites conducted at pagan festivals in a sincere attempt to attract fruitfulness. But most of the rituals centered around the sun and its wonderful gift of fire. For those who possessed fire could produce heat and light, cook food, and melt metal. No wonder there were so many fire rites, and almost every culture had their keepers of the flame. In Rome, Vestal virgins tended the temple fire. If it ever went out, the punishment was death, and new fire was obtained from a lightning strike. In Britain, the Druids kept a never-dying fire in their temples. On the last night of the year, the Celtic people lit huge bonfires on the hills to ward off evil spirits, while the Lord of the Dead gathered up the souls of those who had died during the year. Offerings, sacrifices were made to ensure the souls a safe journey to the other world. Sacred to the sun god, horses were sacrificed, and so were humans. People, mainly criminals, were put into huge wicker and thatch cages shaped like animals or giants and burned to death. The gods appeased, and the souls of the departed loved ones safely on their way to the other world, the feasting, dancing, and merrymaking began. The ghosts of ancestors thronging about the houses were invited to join an enormous banquet, and when the feast was over, the villagers, wearing masks and dressed up as various spirits and souls of the dead, paraded to the outskirts of town, leading the ghosts away with a tremendous racket and flare of torches. Paper hats, noisemakers, the honking of horns, and banging of pots at New Year are the remnants of these parades today. Later, the church's establishment of All Souls Day, or All Hallows Eve, kept most of the New Year's practices of honoring the dead to early November. In Scandinavia, the midwinter festival was called Yule, which meant wheel, and represented the annual revolution of the sun. And like the Roman festival of Saturnalia, it celebrated the solstice. Originally, at Yule, an entire tree, and later a huge log, was dragged into the village or home to be ritually burned. It had to be kindled with a fragment of the previous year's log, and its fire was never permitted to go out by itself. Ancestral spirits were believed to be present in the fire, and were honored by feeding the flames with food and drink. Odin was the greatest and wisest of the Norse gods. His wife was Frigga, goddess of fertility, and his son was Thor, god of thunder. Odin spent most of the year in the distant land of Valhalla, where he lived with the spirits of the great Viking heroes. But on the night of December 21st, they would all come back to Earth, originally like the Celtic Lord of the Dead, to gather up the souls of those who had died during the year, and later, under the influence of Christianity, to seek out evildoers. Odin, with his long white beard, led the hunt on his great white horse, carrying off naughty children in a howl of wind. That night, people in the Netherlands left out offerings of grain for Odin's horse and food for the spirits. But some Christmas customs carry us back to a stage of religion far earlier than Celtic and Norse mythology, to a time before people had anthropomorphic gods, when animals, plants, and forces of nature were regarded as incarnations of powerful spirits, a time whose dying beliefs have become superstitions or are labeled as witchcraft.
So many traditions that we see today, we have absolutely no idea where they came from. You ever wonder why people use a bunny rabbit and in the springtime at Easter? Well, it's obvious, because a bunny is mass reproduction. In the springtime, there were fertility festivals. Fertility, everything comes to life. I mean, I think the book of Jeremiah perfectly tells us what to do with these pagan ideas. Learn not the ways of the heathens. That's exactly what God told the Jews when he told them, when you come into the land that God promised your fathers, don't do what the heathens do. I mean, they weren't even allowed to leave any of the unsaved people living in that land, but they didn't obey, and that's exactly what destroyed them. They were caught up in idolatry and tons of other sins. Remember Moses on Mount Sinai, Aaron at the foot of Mount Sinai? He made a golden calf to worship Jehovah with it. Lord, capital L-O-R-D. You know, one thing that just never ceases to amaze me is these many unbelievers try to come up to me and say, you know, so many religions have very similar principles, similar concepts, that all religions lead to God. As long as you have religion, you'll see God. And I believe that what's happening is these pagan ideas are just making people say, well, you know, did the stories in the Bible really happen? It's causing confusion. Christians ought to be holy, sanctified, ready to give an account for the hope that lies within them. We ought to be able to tell people that we don't believe in all that stuff. We're separate. We're not like that. We're not mixing Christianity with paganism. Then we'll stand as a whole very sanctified, and we'll stand out from among the crowd. We won't be like the heathen. I mean, if you think this is really bad, follow this legend of what people believed in Babylon right through the Roman Empire, and then take a good close look at what people have to say about Santa Claus. In the book of Zechariah, there's a scripture that says, ho, 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 he comes out of the north in Zechariah. And that word ho, ho, ho means cursed 3 times. What did God say about the brass serpent on the pole? He wanted it destroyed because people took that emblem and worshipped that emblem. I mean, we need to get back to what the Bible really teaches.
In parts of Europe during the last Stone Age and early Bronze Age, there lived a small, dark people who survived by hunting animals and gathering roots, fruit, and berries. Many of their gods took the forms of the animals which gave them life, and their priests, or shaman, wore ceremonial horns and sacred skins.